This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us once again a frequent flyer on this particular program, the famous Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck. Welcome once again.
Thank you, sir.
Now, you're here, not in Washington. No, I guess we're just going to have to deal with that. You're personally dealing with it in an acceptable fashion?
I've been here working hard on my own pet project of the Joe Sam for President campaign
No,
committee.
It's premature. Let's not let the cat out of the bag yet. Let's not let the cat out.
I'm sorry. That's a joke.
All right. Now we're going to move past that and get into some more conversations here. So, well, there are a lot of things going on. One of the things that's a big deal are tariffs. So that's a long-standing issue in the United States. It's been here for a long while. And there's been, you could say this, a huge effort to diminish tariffs over the years. And recently, President Trump has brought the concept back and is really raising tariffs in different areas. And maybe we could just pursue, is that a good idea? Is that a bad idea? And there's been a long constitutional story on this, and in American history, there's been a long story on tariffs.
Yes.
Now, if I can recollect this, back in the mercantile days of the 18th century, that was the primary way in which countries raised money.
Correct.
And most countries tried to erect tariffs for revenue and also to protect their embryonic industries. And the U.S. has quite a story about that. I'll throw you a softball.
Indeed. Yes, you go back at least to the very well-known, or at least in my business, the very well-known Navigation Acts of the mid-1600s, which the Parliament actually raised against the Dutch. The Dutch of the 1600s were essentially, they were the FedEx of the world in the 1600s and got rich off that. And so England was trying to cut in on that and said essentially, you can only, it even went beyond tariffs. If you're shipping anything to any British port, including the colonies here in North America, you got to do it in a British ship, or you've got to pay a lot of money otherwise.
Yes.
And it was the enforcement of some of the acts like this that led to the American Revolution 100 years later.
Yes.
So the Sugar Act, for instance.
Right. And well, I mean, I get through the history of this, and I'm going to be very restrained about getting into economic theory. But if one can say this, in America, the tariffs were a very primary way of raising money. Most of the money was raised on tariffs, and I think in the South, the idea was that these tariffs were taking money from Southerners, and the real reason for the tariffs would protect the northern industries. So they were getting protection, and the South was having problems. And I think South Carolina got quite upset about this. Is that correct?
Oh, yes. Let's back up just a little bit, because I think any discussion of tariffs, we have to mention the name of that current Broadway star, Alexander Hamilton. And it was in around 1791 that he first proposed that, and he was really following the British model. He said, look, we've got a lot of natural resources here. We want to become economically independent of Europe as well as politically independent. And the way to do that is to raise trade barriers. And that way, if we make foreign goods too expensive to buy, people will buy American. That will allow American manufacturers to build up American industry. We'll eventually be able to produce everything we need here, and we'll live happily ever after.
Yes.
It wasn't until around 1826, 27, 28, when it was pretty clear that the path that the South had chosen was agriculture, that this began to be seen as a conflict between regions. The industrial North, who wanted high tariffs, which would essentially take money right out of the pockets of Southerners and drop them into the pockets of Northerners, and the agricultural South, who resented that because all it meant for them was higher prices.
Yes, and so we had 1832, South Carolina, Andrew Jackson. So we've had the story of tension a lot, And so just plunging a little bit into the economic theory of the story is that I think really in the UK, the United Kingdom in the 19th century, people developed, they used the word liberal.
Yes.
And its truest idea is that these barriers really were self-defeating. And one of the huge things that happened in the UK was they had these corn laws that meant that when corn was grain, when grain was
Yes.
imported to make bread, the government kept the price artificially high in order to support the Tory aristocracy that
Yes.
owned the land, and so that was just giving them money, and that was taking the money from the workers that needed to have inexpensive bread.
Yes.
And so that had a huge impact when this was tossed out. And I believe
Around the 1830s, 1840s.
well, yeah, 40s maybe. And I believe another thing that happened in this was they had the Great Famine in Ireland, and so the Great Potato Famine. So many of our Irish friends came over to eat.
Yeah, the stats on that: 8 million people in Ireland in 1840, 4 million in 1850. 2 million had left, 2 million had starved.
Famine, and referable to keeping the price high. So
Yes.
these trade barriers were I think were progressively under assault, at least in some circles. There was always the idea of free trade, and particularly maritime powers that could do this. They had access to products. They'd like to bring the products in, and the idea of free trade really worked a lot in the 100 years after Waterloo. I mean,
Yes.
gradually things were getting better and better, and in regards to free trade.
Yeah. And that's one reason why we raised the tariffs here, to back up just a bit, because after the War of 1812, England was essentially dumping over here. Which is why we finally, in 1816, embraced Hamilton's idea of a high tariff to try to forestall that.
Right, and so we have, it's a complicated kind of thing about personal benefit. And so there's an argument, well, we sort of say a little bit into this about comparative advantage. Mm-hmm. So I think in Act 1, we sort of pick this up if you're reading, most people pass through this idea that each country has a comparative advantage. And so, for instance, if you have a lot of, I don't know, trees, you're good for growing trees, and you can grow trees, and then you're the best tree grower, and you can produce trees cheaper than anywhere else. You can have a world market. And contrary-wise, people that grow, peanuts, they can grow peanuts the best, and so they can then have the cheapest. You can get the cheapest peanuts, the cheapest timber, and the whole world will be happy if those circumstances exist.
That's the line, anyway.
That's the line, and the problem is in doing this. Well, maybe many people don't play fair, and the other issue is the social cost in doing something like this. So, if you have, we discussed Chicago earlier.
Yes.
About what's going on in difficult inner city circumstances, and jobs would be better. It would help things. So if a lot of jobs that are sort of entry-level jobs that require basic manual skills, that other countries can do that better than we can do here, you wind up with a huge number of people that don't really have any useful employment, and the comparative advantage the U.S. has turns out to be in high-tech jobs. So you have Silicon Valley flourishing, and I don't know, maybe Hollywood does well. They have particular comparative advantage, but relatively few jobs generated, and so that requires to make the situation work. High enough taxes to get enough welfare transference to keep everybody at least fed.
Or we could go back to an idea that you broached in our previous episode and impose population controls.
Yes, we could. I mean, I did that a bit carefully, but that's right. Well, so you have this difficult world situation where the world's population is expanding enormously, and so many countries have thousands of workers that could do low-tech jobs, and their comparative advantage means that anything that requires manual labor can be done less expensively elsewhere, and thus the U.S. is going to lose jobs, and there'll be some societal damage when that occurs.
Yes. Well, go ahead.
Well, okay, I'll keep going. And so that's at least that's one idea about it. The other idea is that if you do put these tariffs in place, then the government, it's a tax, so you have a substantial tax, and indeed the global living standard diminishes. That's assuming that everyone is playing fair, which is another subject we can discuss. But assuming everyone plays fair, you put in barriers to entry, put substantial tariff arrangement in place, then presumably a major part of the country can find jobs, and they can have, you could say, a psychologically better situation. On the other hand, to do that, the global GNP of the country is reduced. So the country becomes poorer. So I mean, that's sort of what's out there in general. And that's maybe you can make a comment about that, and then we can talk about people that don't play fair after that.
Sure. Well, I guess my starting point, and I would preface this by saying that I'm not an economist, and I'm not even playing one on TV.
Yes, you are, but that's okay. You are playing one tonight on TV.
I'm playing one on TV. I think I would start with the question of nationalism versus internationalism or globalism. That who do we feel our first responsibility to? Is it to our nation, this artificial construct called the United States of America, or is it to the human community worldwide? And there are advantages to each. For instance, even if we're nationalists, we could say that ultimately it is a benefit to us here in the United States that the rainforests don't go away. And so we're going to sound like globalists, and we're going to slap a really high tariff on Brazilian products and Argentinian orange juice and anything that results from the clear cutting of the rainforest.
Right.
But so that's the first issue, and it's a complicated one. I do think that a lot of the people who talk globalization tend to be actually just using that as a smokescreen for being really, really selfish, and I think people can buy into that. That, say, Apple Corporation likes low tariffs, so Apple Corporation can take advantage of the low labor costs in China. And they're doing that not because it helps the United States, and they're doing that not because it helps the community of man. They're doing that because it helps the Apple balance sheet that's now topped out $1 trillion. And secondly, the consumer, I think, is very short-sighted if he buys into this. He is seduced by the dark side, according to Obi-Wan Kenobi, by going to Wally World and buying all these really cheap products and not realizing that by doing that, he is reducing his long-term chances of getting a blue-collar job here in the good old United States, because those jobs have gone over the border.
Well, actually, we've I think stumbled on a major issue and problem for this century. If you can look at the last century, the U.S. was the predominant, it turned out to be the predominant power. Indeed. And you could say it was the U.S. century. There are books about that. Yes. So World War I, World War II, beat communism. So at the end of the 20th century, the U.S. is a predominant power for many reasons. It has all the societal successes we have. But at the same time, our success rests on our access to science, technology, and our patents, and our ability to sort of create things and make things work. On the other hand, the rest of the world, the other 95% of the world, is in many ways rapacious. They'd like to have what we have, and there's no reason they would not have what we have if all of our advantages leak away. And they leak away by just access to our technology, and I think in some ways that's what's happened. So a lot of the controversy that's going on, particularly with China, is you have 1.4 billion people that are motivated, intelligent, hardworking, diligent. They've got all the virtue, not everyone, but many people in that huge country have great virtues, and they can easily, once they have access to our technology, they can really outdo us. It's certainly no reason they could not do that. And so one of the things going on, which is connected to globalism and free trade, is the idea that the hegemony the U.S. has enjoyed is melting away, and one of the reasons it's melting away are these circumstances. And it would be not unreasonable to imagine the role of the U.S. in this would be reduced in this century. As you look at the amount of, let's say, the scientific papers being written, the things that are happening, the employment arrangements around the country, why couldn't people do just as well in Mexico, in Monterrey, Mexico, as they could in Monterey, California, so to speak? So there's no reason they couldn't. They have the same technology, the same this, the same that. So in some ways, I think one of the things going on, we're discussing the idea of tariffs, it's a late attempt to put a moat around the U.S. to preserve its hegemony and protect workers. But I've got substantial doubts that it's going to work. It's so late in the game.
I think that's the key. I think you're right. The late in the game that China has now got so much economic clout that we no longer can beat them over the head with a tariff, because they can, they've got a big club as well and can retaliate. So it's possible that that the day for that has passed. That it would have worked earlier. That indeed it was working earlier, but as you say, late in the game. And I really don't know how to turn the clock back.
Well, one of the things that's happening, you could say this, is that the power of the hegemony the U.S. possessed in the last century could be used to enforce its moral viewpoint. So you could say one of the things about the U.S., they've done some pretty heroic things that our country has, our ancestors have. They smashed Hitler, they did this, they did that, they sent their technology all over the world, they tried to help people, they've opened doors, they've really been pretty magnanimous, more magnanimous than almost, in my opinion, almost any other country, despite whatever shortfalls people tossed in our plate. And that's been the set of circumstances. But if the power goes elsewhere, those other nations will enforce their world viewpoints on the U.S. And in many places, I'm finally getting into this story about playing fair. We have to remember that in an ideal world, if we had no tariffs, we had one great community, that would be great and wonderful, and that's probably the role of morality. The real deal, the way morality works, is that you have to, the natural impulse is to value your country first, your state first, your family first, and then finally you as first. But if you say, well, my viewpoint is I'm overcoming all that, and I now just want all the species to be treated in an equal moral fashion, and I will not put my son before anyone else's son. I won't believe in nepotism. And now, to get to that point is an extremely difficult task, and it almost is an impossible task because of our brain structure.
And is it a survival trait ultimately? Would you say that it is or not?
Oh, I think it's hardwired to look after your own DNA. It's so hardwired in the brain that to overcome it, you have to get great spiritual strength to do this. Yes. It really does require and occasionally it happens, but it's a difficult place to go.
But if you have a selfless person and he's up against a world that is fundamentally selfish and has no problem with that, what happens to the selfless person? And what happens to,
Well, there is I won't overkill this, but there is a duality in the human brain where you have selfishness and then you also have altruism and concern for the species. And in some ways what happens in a Darwinian sense is that survivability, it often depends, you have to look at your species. The survival of your species is something that is of consequence to you and is hardwired as well. So many times people would sacrifice themselves for they die in war, they do this. They make huge sacrifices
Yes.
for a broader group. Now, having said all that, what we're really getting into here, in a way, is if you're an internationalist and you're a globalist and you want this higher world, it's difficult. And if you could obtain the higher world, then presumably everybody would benefit. So our living standard would go, I'll make some numbers up, they'll go up by 10%. But in, I don't know, Nigeria, it'll go up 100%, or the Ukraine 300%, or name whatever. So
that's seen as a very altruistic
right.
outcome.
So an altruistic world would, particularly the people that are on the bottom tier of the world, would correspondingly be elevated up 90%, and the people that are on the top now would go up, I don't know, 10%, but everybody would go up. And in doing that, having people equal to you when you were on top is a difficult thing. I mean, just the way that people are. It's difficult to say, I'm up 10%. On the other hand, everybody is the same with me now, and they all have the same rights, privileges. There's no sense of dominance that I might have had earlier because of this situation. So that's a hard way to go. So that makes the globalist international thing difficult. The other thing is that you have to, and I mean, I'm sort of getting into sort of the Trump argument in a way, is the other players are not playing fair. No one else plays fair. So the U.S., I mean, maybe this is right at the meat of the issue. The U.S. is playing in a moral, superior fashion where they want the whole world to enjoy things. And on the other side of the fence, those people or those countries are saying that, look how naive the Americanos are to imagine that if we can romp and stomp and, I don't know, drive our tanks through Washington, we do it, or we'll do whatever. We want to be the big dogs in the world, and this gives us a chance to do that. And we're not internationalists. We don't want the paradisio the U.S. wants. We've had such a hard time of it. We're going to use every benefit we can possibly extract from this, trade-wise, any way we can do it to help our side. And the U.S. is letting us do that, and ergo, they're particularly naive. So that seems to be, in some ways, the dispute that's out there.
Well, let me throw a slight curveball. Let me modify the hypothetical a little bit. Let's say that you are an altruist and you do want what is good for the whole of the species, but your resources are limited. I mean, once again, I'll often show in one of my classes John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, and he has a statement in there because we are now at the stage for the first time where we have it in our hands to eradicate all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life.
Yes.
And I say, well, I probably agree with the latter part of that statement with the bomb.
Right.
But the idea that we can eradicate all forms of human poverty, that's just Kennedy talking. So let's say that we lack the resources to do that. We're altruistic, we want to give back, we want to make somebody else's life better, but we don't have enough to make everybody's life better.
Yes.
So who do we choose? Do we choose the poor people in what we used to call the third world, who really are living at almost a Stone Age poverty level in some places? Or instead, do we divert those resources to our more immediate community, people with whom we see on the street corner, with whom we have interactions? And in that way, we set up a possible conflict between our nation, our immediate community, and the rest of the world. And if you look at it that way, that could provide an altruistic defense of nationalism and of high tariffs.
Well, you could say, I mean, you could, and this is a statement I often use. I call this the U.S. is the world's life raft.
Yes.
So if in fact if the country is taken down just by our competitors, then our moral viewpoints, whatever they are going to be crushed, and a real light would go out. And so you could make, there is an argument to say, from an altruistic point of view, that preservation of our culture is necessary as long as the culture is pursuing great moral ends.
Yes.
If the culture, which is a point, So if the culture becomes contaminated by the idea that you're erecting tariffs, barriers, you're trying to protect the U.S., and then in the end, it's not that you have this as the city on the hill, the world's life raft. Instead, it's a selfish kind of deal where people that are of American descent are going to have some privileged life where no one else will. And it's quite natural to want that, I think.
Yes.
But it creates a bigger problem,
Yes.
which is that if everybody thinks this way, then this horrific world conflict is inevitable, isn't it? So the real thing that as we consider the world, the idea of there are tremendous advantages in internationalism, one world viewpoints, and the biggest thing out there is not getting into war and national conflicts. So when the U.S., as President Trump is doing, there are these institutions that are put there to basically maintain tranquility, peace. There are all these efforts to do that. And if you say, well, you're my enemy, I'm going to do this and that, and you've been a subterranean enemy. I recognize that you're sort of but I'm going to just make certain that you're an active enemy. And I think the idea is you're always going to have subterranean enemies. I mean, I think that's fair. You're going to have tensions between people, even of goodwill. There's going to be some kind of tension, and to turn the situation into a world conflict is distressing.
Yes.
And it's very. And I don't. Trump has some points that are reasonable. You could say, well, maybe we need to get some new arrangements with China, and the technology theft is the big problem. And the world, what can we do about that, about technology? And the other point is if China is basically impinging on other nations, that's a problem. I mean, there are these difficulties that are present.
Yes. And something else to consider on this, and this is a model that I've used before, you've probably heard me talk about it before, probably on this television show, is essentially the difference between a maritime civil libertarian oriented civilization versus a continental collectivist oriented civilization. And the United States is one of the former, that maritime nations tend to be free market and they tend to be civil libertarian for a lot of reasons I can't go into here. Take me for a class sometime if you're interested. Now that doesn't mean to say that we haven't done bad things. I mean, look at what we've done to the Indians, look at slavery. But I like to think that the United States, on the whole balance, has done more good than evil. But what happens if China develops the kind of economy that has traditionally been held by a maritime country, but has that collectivist idea that the individual life is expendable, doesn't matter, can be thrown away in the service of the state? That's a very scary concept to think about for human rights going down the ages from here.
That's quite,
So,
I mean, it's a time for another conversation. But I'd close out with this. I mean, I think the crucial word in the West might be freedom, and the crucial word in China might be harmony.
Yes.
So the crux of the Chinese worldview is the necessity for harmony, everyone getting along with each other, and also a fairly rigid hierarchy so that your sharp elbows don't work. And in the West, the idea is freedom means you can be non-harmonious. You can use your elbows, you can jump around, you can get up the greasy pole
Yes.
better than your neighbor can. And these are substantial problems, particularly, and I'm going to close out with this, is that if you're in some kind of trade conflict with China, and China has a very centralized, authoritarian, controlled mechanism where the state really can say what happens.
Which it largely does.
You're not going to win easily in some dispute where on our side of the fence, the people who are impacted by the dispute have the freedom to violently object. So the Chinese have a trump card in regards to that.
Yes, my last comment would be, harmony sounds like a wonderful word, but that harmony is often enforced. If the nail is sticking up, the execution van comes around and takes care of the problem, and harmony is restored.
Well, so much for that, Bucky. Thanks for
Thank you,
being
sir.
with us tonight. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.